Hi, and welcome to Political Science 101, and this is the history of the American political system. I'm your instructor, Jennifer Hobson-Plattner, and today we are on Chapter 4, and we are going to be discussing civil liberties in our government book. First thing we need to do is look at what we're supposed to accomplish in this chapter, and that is on your first page. Define the term civil liberties, explain how civil liberties is different from civil rights, and state the constitutional basis for our civil liberties. List and describe the freedoms guaranteed by the First Amendment and explain how the courts have interpreted and applied these freedoms. And discuss why Americans are increasingly concerned about privacy rights. Summarize how the Constitution and Bill of Rights protect the rights of the accused persons. This chapter does open up talking about gun control. Do U.S. citizens really need military-style rifles under the right to bear arms in the Second Amendment? It talks about some huge tragedies in our country that can't be ignored. Where in December 2012, a shooter killed 26 children and teachers in Sandy Hook Elementary School in Connecticut, and very much a tragedy. Also talks about a shooter who used a similar rifle, semi-automatic, when he killed 12 people and wounded 58 in a theater in Colorado. And of course, the recent activity of shootings in Orlando and the gay nightclub. Obviously, this is definitely a problem at the forefront of our country that needs to be discussed and looked at and recognized. The Second Amendment, it divides kind of the two opposing sides, talks about the right to bear arms, and the side that feels that M16s and M4s are needed and a part of the rights. And then you have the opposing side that, you would never go, citizens don't need military-style rifles, is the opposing side, talking about how if you're going to hunt a deer, it really isn't very good sportsmanship to take a semi-automatic, because it's not really a sport. There's no skill involved if that's what you're hunting. So I would really encourage you to look at that more closely and in light of the different tragedies that have occurred as well. Okay, we're going to talk about the difference between civil liberties and civil rights. Oftentimes they are used interchangeably, and if you watch the Crash Course U.S. Government and Politics, I believe it's number 23 that is on your module, it talks about the difference of civil rights and civil liberties. It does a very good job of differentiating them. I will try here, but sometimes when we hear things in a different venue, in a different way, it's easier to understand them. So I really encourage you to watch the videos on your different modules for this week, for week 3. Okay. Civil liberties really came out of the Magna Carta, which was signed in 1215 because there was severe abuse between the king and his subjects. He was just doing whatever he wanted, taking whatever he wanted. He'd take your horse, he'd take your cart, he'd take your wife, he'd take your daughters. Anything and everything was subject to his seizure. So the Magna Carta in 1215 really, that's where civil liberties and these rights were coming out of. So week number 1, you were supposed to read the Magna Carta, and if you didn't, which I'm sure you did, you could go back in that module for week 1 and you could review, because it actually says the different liberties and what you can and cannot do are listed out. Very good to revisit that. There was a reason that was the first document that we read for primary source. Okay. On page 74, it does talk about the difference. It's really tricky, and you have to listen very carefully, and that's why I have several videos to kind of back up this idea, so that the more you kind of hear it, the more you understand the difference between the two. Civil liberties are legal and constitutional rights to protect citizens from government action. So civil liberties is more of what the government cannot do, cannot cross the line to do. Okay, and one way that really helps me understand that is that Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act in 1988. And the reason he signed this was because it was an apology to the Japanese, both citizens and living here legally, during World War II, because we were at war with Japan. Some steps were taken that were extremely, not only unconstitutional, but they were definitely an infringement of liberties of U.S. citizens, or even people who were here living with that were living here legally. In my U.S. history class that I have taught before, we've actually read accounts of Japanese citizens that were taken. They froze their bank accounts. That means their wives that were not taken. If their wives weren't taken, they had no money. They were taken places they didn't know where they were. They couldn't contact anyone. And really there wasn't any evidence to suggest that they were in any way, shape, or form connected to World War II and the Japanese side. So Reagan signed this in an apology, and there was actually a payment made, if you read more about it, for the infringement of loss of property and liberty. Because, as you know, that's one of the, the right to property and liberty is one of the rights in our U.S. Constitution. They were taken to internment camps, more like work camps. There was a lot of sickness, a lot of dysentery, disease, death, not clean, not fed well, nothing to do, just really glum places, just really horrific. And the one that I had my students read about before was actually in South Dakota, and which was really strange because a lot of these Japanese citizens, as well as legal Japanese working in the U.S., maybe as fishermen or whatnot, when they went to South Dakota on the train, the people who took them in, sometimes they were, at this time, it's the 1940s, they'd never seen an Asian American ever. So that even compounded kind of the atrocities that happened. So anyway, that is very, very interesting that he signed the civil liberties. But that helps me realize that, the government stepped too far, and that's what civil liberties is set up for, to keep the government back. Okay, and if you continue, it talks about civil rights, which we'll discuss more in the next chapter, but the civil rights, so civil liberties are the limitations on government action. Okay, civil liberties, setting forth what the government cannot do. And then civil rights, on the other hand, specifies what the government must do to protect. So civil rights is to protect, usually not the majority. And as you read the chapter, I don't know if you picked up that the Bill of Rights is actually put in place not to protect the majority, because in a democracy, the majority kind of rules. The majority kind of rules the roost. So the majority just goes with the flow, and they are protected. Civil rights and the Bill of Rights, maybe you can correlate them that way, civil rights, Bill of Rights, is to protect the minority under the law. And this protection, so it's not for, the religion that is followed by most of America. It's for protection of the religion where only a few practice, to make sure that they have the rights, the same rights, to practice in a proper manner as those of the majority. Okay. It talks about the writ of habeas corpus and an order that requires an official to bring a specified prisoner into court and explain to the judge why the person is being held in jail. You cannot be held just without a reason. And if you go back to the Japanese internment camps, they were held without a reason. They were not given a reason. They would ask, and they had no idea. Okay, so it goes through some different legal terms. Bill of Attainder is a legislative act that directly punishes a specifically named individual or a group or a class of individuals without a trial. Okay, so that is definitely a problem because you want, in the Constitution, trial by jury. And then you have ex post facto laws after the fact. So if you committed an act and that it was legal at the time, you are not, it's not retroactive that you will be tried for that once it comes into effect. So you can't be kind of back prosecuted. Okay, and then we talk about the Bill of Rights, and you need to read carefully on page 75, those Bill of Rights ratified by the states. The first 8 amendments grant the people specific rights and liberties. The remaining reserve certain rights and powers to people and to the states. Okay, and it was really, the Bill of Rights was to protect the minority, and I really feel like that is something new that I'm wrapping my head around because I always thought it was to protect the majority. And as you read this, no, that's not what the writers of the Constitution, what their ideology was behind it. It was to protect people who were not part of the majority, the small factions of people, so that they are not persecuted, okay, or oppressed. To protect the rights of those in the minority against the will of the majority, kind of trying to change them, trying to, Americanize them, or trying to get them to remove all of their beliefs and their practices and habits that are not illegal. They just are different than the majority. Okay. All right. Lots of different clauses. We have the Due Process Clause, the 5th and 14th Amendments, that the government will not illegally or arbitrarily deprive a person of life, liberty, or property. And that goes back, we just talked about that with our Japanese internment camps, that you cannot be, for no reason, your life, liberty, or property cannot be taken away from you. Okay. I love the list on page 77. When these amendments came into fruition, so you have 1925, freedom of speech, okay? And you have the court case that was correlating it. Freedom of the press, right to a lawyer in capital punishment cases, freedom of assembly, right to a petition, freedom of religion was 1940. And you have the different Cantwell versus Connecticut. Separation of church and state, right to public trial, no unreasonable searches and seizures. Okay, so you have the Bill of Rights, incorporating the Bill of Rights into the 14th Amendment. Okay. Okay, it's very important when we're looking at the freedom of religion to realize when there's a contradiction in our history. Often in politics and when you're studying U.S. history, you find contradictions, okay? And that you need to pay special attention when you see these contradictions, because these contradictions will kind of resurface and be visible later on. And you really need to ask yourself as an American citizen, are we contradicting ourselves? Are we giving everyone freedom, even people who disagree with us? Put yourself in the place of someone else, in that sort of mindset. So the laws and the religion in the colonies was really interesting. On page 77, it talks about many of the colonists came to America in the first place to escape religious persecution. So they're coming over because they want to escape it. They want religious freedom. But then as soon as they set up and get comfortable, they are persecuting others that are different from them. So they're leaving because they're different, coming over, and then they're starting the whole cycle over again. All right. So we really need to think as citizens, are we persecuting people? when we say we want religious freedom, are we doing the same? Or whatever freedom it is. I love the example they gave in 1610, Jamestown Colony.